This is a text from an official data insights question. I want to use this text to emphasize, to explain how I read, how I make sense of a text. I see a lot of people don't follow this process, so I thought let me take a text which I struggle with and let me explain how I would read as a text that I struggle with. So it says some studies of how it was that. So first of all, this structure is not very common. Some studies of how something. So I'll take a pause and I think some studies of how it was. Okay, so there are studies of that are talking about how something happened. This is how I process. Okay, so I'll be speaking very consciously and I'll be sort of telling about my thought process. So of course I'll be slow and I'll take a lot of time to explain that. It's not that my thought process will be so slow, but the kind of thoughts will be similar. And that's what I want to emphasize here. That's how I process information. So it says some studies of how it was. Okay, so first of all, my mind will take a small pause there because this construction is not very common for me. I think, okay, some studies of how something happened. Okay, so the studies are telling how something happened. Okay, how it was that Prussia, I'm not sure the pronunciation, so excuse me for that. How Prussia resisted the wave of European democratization. So it's saying how it was that this happened. So again, you see, I'm trying to simplify the construction in my mind. How it was that something happened. Right? Because how it was that this construction is also new for me. It's not extremely familiar that I use in my everyday life. So I'm trying to understand what this construction means. So to understand this construction, I'm trying to simplify the remaining part and just focusing on this, how it was that something happened. Yeah, how can it happen? How can it happen mean? Okay, perhaps it was not expected to happen. That's why we are saying how it was that this happened. Okay, so there is a difference between saying how it was that this happened and how it happened. Right? So there will be a difference between saying how Prussia resisted the wave of European democratization. So that essentially means that how this happened. So it is just going to emphasize that, yeah, how this happened. Whatever. Now he's saying how it was that this happened. So there is a kind of a surprise also that, yeah, it should not have happened, but then how did that happen? So that's the difference. And this difference I will understand as I read. So there will be a pause within me to understand that, okay, this is what it is trying to say. Okay, this is very subtle. So again, for me at least, and I think it's going to be so for a lot of people, if it's subtle for me. Of course, some people will be comfortable, but the point is, I take pauses. If there is something is difficult for me, I take pauses. And this is something that I find missing in a lot of people. They keep reading even though they don't understand. So it's like a stream of words for them. But it's not a stream of words for me. It's an idea. So I try to understand what it is saying. And I take pauses as I read to really understand. I don't continue reading with the hope that eventually I'll understand. No. As I read, I understand. So it's saying studies of how it was that. So how it was that this happened. So there is a kind of element of surprise that how could this happen? That Prussia resisted the wave of European democratization. Okay, so this country resisted the wave of. Okay, so there is a wave of European democratization. So there is a wave. There is a trend. Everybody is sort of getting democratized. How could this country resist this? Yeah, so naturally it makes sense that this should come as a surprise that how could this country resist this wave of European democratization? Yeah, in the 19th century. Okay, yeah, so there was a wave this in the 19th century and how it was that this country could resist this wave. The studies are about these. So there are multiple studies and saying some studies of how it was that this happened point to this country's unequal distribution of land ownership. So So these studies point to, so I understand now this point is a verb for this study. So this is essentially the construction of this sentence. Okay, just to understand the sentence, of course, I need to know the construction. That it's saying some studies of what? Of how this till century, and these studies point to Prussia's unequal distribution of land ownership as a principal explanation. Okay, so these studies, so some studies point to unequal distribution. So these studies are saying, how could this country resist the wave of democratization? Essentially, how could this country not get democratized? And these studies are saying that, okay, there was unequal distribution of land ownership as a principal explanation. So they're giving the primary reason that this country did not get democratized was that there was unequal distribution of land ownership. Okay, so again I try to understand that how can this be an explanation. Okay, if there were equal distribution of land ownership, yeah, then probably everybody is equal, so it makes sense to have democracy there. So because there is unequal distribution, some people are really rich, some people are poor, so rich people may not want poor to also have a right to vote. So that makes sense that, yeah, there is a resistance towards democratization, so there is unequal distribution of land ownership. This is another aspect of comprehension that I do that I don't find a lot of people doing actively. Some connections our mind forms naturally, some connections our mind doesn't form naturally. So I see that people don't make this effort. Whatever connections our mind forms naturally, those connections are formed, but people don't make an effort. But I make efforts to form these connections. If it is saying this is the principal explanation for resisting the wave of democratization, this is the reason why it did not get democratized, I try to understand, but how could this be the reason? This is just the way I read anything. Of course, it's going to take time. And so, of course, in the test, I may take certain calls. But when practicing, I try to read and understand everything this way, because in practice, essentially what I'm trying to establish is clarity. In the exam, of course, if I'm at a stage where it takes me huge amount of time to understand all this, naturally I'll not spend a huge amount of time. Then that will also, and if I'm not understanding a lot of things, naturally that will reflect in my score also. But the process of learning, or when you are practicing, this is the way I would recommend to try to really understand each and everything you come across. Otherwise, you're not learning. If you're not learning, then what's the use of practice? Let me get back. So essentially, when I read the first sentence, I see it's talking about some studies, and studies are about how this country, Prussia, again, I don't know the exact pronunciation, but how this country, Prussia, could resist or could not get democratized. Why it did not get democratized, even though a lot of countries were. There was a wave of European democratization. And it's saying that the primary reason is, these studies are saying the primary reason is there was unequal distribution of land ownership. Some people had a lot of land, some people didn't have much land. And, so the second sentence starts with and. Political figures from areas in Prussia. Okay, so now it's talking about political people from areas in Russia with high inequality in land ownership. So it's talking about those areas which had high inequality. So there was land ownership was highly unequal. Some people had a lot of land, some people really were, let's say, without land. These political figures tended to be the staunchest opponents of democratic reforms. So again, this is in line with my understanding that, okay, so probably these I'll not say this is in line with, or essentially this is supporting the first statement. Yeah, whenever there is high inequality in land ownership, so there was strong opposition to democratic reform. So that supports that, yeah, that this unequal distribution of land ownership could be the primary explanation. Why it is the explanation? That is what I was trying to understand. That probably if you have a lot of land, others don't have a lot of land, then you will not want them to have equal right of vote. But that is not the second sentence. It's the second sentence is just supporting the first. the first sentence, but it's not really supporting my understanding of that connection. Then it says, however, again, I see that there is a contrast here. And then it says arguments. So now there is a contrast. So far, the author has said, okay, there are studies which are saying that Prussia did not get democratized because there was unequal distribution of land. And the second sentence supports that, yeah, whenever there is a high inequality in land ownership, there was a lot of opposition to democratic reforms. But now the author is taking a shift. However, so at this stage, I expect author to sort of take a contrary standpoint or to go in a different direction, opposite direction. Why? Because it is however, first of all, and secondly, it was saying some studies say that, and there is a support for that studies. So some studies say, so the author is not saying, I'm saying, some studies say there is a support for that study, and now however. So I expect that, okay, probably, perhaps the author will take a contrary standpoint. It says arguments that focus only on those figures conflict with landless people. Okay, however, and it's talking about which argument? Arguments that focus only. So there are arguments that are focusing only on those figures. Which figures? Political figures from, let's say, areas in Prussia with high inequality and land ownership. So again, this is another thing. It says those figures. I'll go back to understand which figures it is talking about. A lot of people don't really try to understand the exact reference. And thereby they end up compromising on comprehension. So the arguments that focus only on these political figures conflict with landless people. So I can understand why these political figures will have conflict with landless people. That I understand, because of course they are opposing democratic reforms. So landless people would want democratic reforms. They would want to have at least a right to vote, right? They don't have land, but at least they would want to be a part of at least they would want to be able to vote. So it makes sense that they will have conflicts, but it's saying argument that focus only on these conflicts. Ignore something. So essentially I'm expecting that it must be talking about the arguments of these studies, which are saying that unequal distribution of land ownership is the primary explanation. Why do you expect? Because now it's criticizing these arguments. These arguments are ignoring something, and it's taking however. So again, I was already expecting that author will go against it. So I'm expecting these arguments to be those same arguments given by those studies. But those studies are focusing only on the conflicts of these political figures with landless people. That I don't understand. Okay, and I tried, but I couldn't still get a hold on it, that they are focusing only on these conflicts. So then I moved on. Okay, so I tried my best to understand why would these arguments focus only on these conflicts with landless people. I couldn't get a hold on it. So eventually I moved on. Eventually, of course, anybody will move on. You won't spend your entire life on this. But the point is, I try my best to understand. Even when I move on, I have this understanding that, okay, I have not understood this aspect of the text. So now it's saying arguments that focus only on these conflicts ignore the fact. So these arguments ignore something. What do they ignore? That political figures are not only representatives of socio-economic interests. So if you understand the structure here, the structure is some arguments are ignoring that X is not only A but also B. I'm not writing anything, so you'll have to you can write it on your own. Essentially, it's saying these arguments are ignoring that X is not only A but also B. This is how I process, by the way, information. Okay, so I'm looking at the structure of the sentence and saying, okay, the argument is ignoring the fact that X is not only A but also B. So in my mind, it's saying that I understand that, okay, so probably the argument is taking into account that it's A, but it's not taking into account B. It's saying argument is ignoring the fact that X is not only A but also B. For example, I say that you are ignoring the fact that he is not only innocent but also lazy. Okay, so probably I'm thinking that you are ignoring the fact that he is lazy. So he is not only innocent but also lazy, right? And you are ignoring this. So essentially in this construction, if you think about it, and probably you may need more explanation, but the construction to me indicates that the argument is ignoring the but also part. Okay, so probably it's taking into account that the first not only part, but it's ignoring the but also part. That's what the structure means. And you can create several examples if you just want to understand this construction. So argument is ignoring that X is not only A, but also B. So then when I read this, again, as I said, I comprehend that it's saying that these arguments are taking into account that they are representative of socioeconomic interests, political figures. So if they are representatives of socioeconomic interest, so they are representatives. So they represent the socioeconomic interest. So whatever is the socioeconomic interest, so there is economic aspect to it. And I'm trying to understand that these figures are actually opposing democratic reforms, right? So probably they are driven by economic interest, right? So they are perhaps supporting people with high ownership, high land ownership. So they are representatives of socioeconomic interest. So perhaps the arguments are taking this into account, and that's how they are saying that these are supporting people with high land ownership. They have a lot of social power. They have a lot of economic power. So they are representatives of these interests, but also political actors. So when I say, so political figures are not only this, political figures are also political actors. So now I know that these arguments are ignoring this aspect. So the arguments of these studies are ignoring that political figures are political actors embedded in particular contexts. Okay, so these studies or these arguments are ignoring that these political figures are political actors embedded in particular contexts. So again, it doesn't make sense to say that that these arguments are ignoring that political figures are political actors. Political figures, naturally, nobody will ever make a mistake of ignoring that political figures are political actors, right? Then what are they ignoring? They are ignoring that they are political actors of a certain type. Which type? Political actors embedded in particular contexts. So these arguments are ignoring that these political figures are embedded in particular context, that shape, and that is now that clause is providing more information about context. Which context? The context that shape whether these actors support democratic reforms. Okay, so these arguments are ignoring that these political figures are a part of certain contexts, and these contexts can determine or shape or influence whether these people will end up supporting democratic reforms. So for me, this sentence is trying to say that it's not just the socio-economic part, or that these political figures are opposing democratic reforms because, let's say, because of wealthy people or people having a lot of land ownership, but also because they are a part of certain context. So it's not just the social power, economic power they are supporting, but also because these political figures are a part of a certain context, and that context is playing a role in their opposing democratic reforms. This is what I understand from this sentence. And So it's essentially adding up that that is not the only reason, because it was saying it's the principal explanation, that unequal distribution of land ownership. But now the author is saying, yeah, that is there, but the context in which these political figures are, those contexts also shape whether they support reform. So their context must have also led them to oppose democratic reform. So the author is adding, saying that this is also could be an explanation. And then it's saying historians must take such context into account if they hope to explain what transpired in Prussia during this period. So it's saying that, yeah, they must take this into account because this is also part of explanation. This is what it says. But you see, it took me a lot of time, a lot of energy, a lot of pauses to really be able to make sense. And this is a hard text, even for me, to understand. Of course, a lot of other texts which will not be hard for me will be hard for a lot of people. But the process will remain the same. You take pauses, you try to understand each and every part, you understand the construction of the sentence, then you understand, you look at the phrases, those figures, you make connection, which figures, why would they conflict with landless people. This is how I understand. This is what I want to emphasize in this video, that this is the process of comprehension. If you are not comprehending a lot of things in a text, naturally you'll get questions wrong. Then you may think that, oh, I'm getting questions wrong because I don't know the concept or some tricky thing there. No, you're just not understanding what is being said. Now, if you understand all this, when I understood all this, let me put it in my way. So when I understood all this, I could understand the overall purpose of the text is to add an explanation, right? It's saying that, yeah, that could be an explanation, but this could also be a part of explanation, that their context was shaping whether they support democratic reforms. So they were not supporting democratic reforms also because of the context in which they were. So the overall purpose of the text is to really ask the historians to look at a bigger picture, or sort of go beyond just one explanation and look at another aspect of the explanation. And if I look at just the bold-faced part, I see that the bold-faced part is, the sentence is just that these arguments are ignoring this fact. So it's just a critique of those studies, of those arguments, right? Because the statement is just saying that arguments ignore this. So this is just pure simple criticism of those arguments, that the arguments are ignoring this. So once I really get a hang of the text, then solving the question was not very difficult for me. What was difficult for me and what took me a lot of time was to really understand what this text meant. I hope this video helps you to understand the process of reading a text, process of comprehending a text. Thank you.